There is a reason that gas prices are up globally, and it comes down to what's been happening in the Strait of Hormuz, where oil and gas traffic has been significantly choked off since the war began and is now being impacted by a U.S. blockade of Iranian ports. Someone who watches maritime trade flows considerably, it is Alexis Ellender, and he is a senior analyst at Kpler, a global trade firm that tracks maritime data. Alexis, good day to you.
Good morning, David.
Very glad to have you here. Look, I just wonder broadly, what is happening in and around the Strait of Hormuz, the approaches, the Gulf of Oman? Is there the same level of traffic now that some more ships are able to get through?
So what we've seen is trade never actually stopped through the Strait of Hormuz. There were always a few vessels trickling through. I think what's changed, obviously, over the last few days is this US announced blockade initially of everything and then narrowed down to Iranian ports. So what's really interesting we've seen over the last couple of days is we saw sort of 5 of the large tankers coming from Iran, leaving, going through the Strait of Hormuz, and these have actually now kind of stopped west of where we believe is the area where the US vessels are kind of setting the line for the blockade. And actually some of these vessels have kind of turned back towards the Iranian coast, while another seems to be going back towards the Strait of Hormuz. So to a certain extent, it does seem to be that they are halting trade. In terms of other countries' vessels, it's really a trickle. We are not seeing anything like what we'd expect from normal trade.
And why is that?
I mean, the risk of attack on vessels is too high. The risk appetite for commercial shipping is very low. If your vessel is at risk of attack, in this instance from potentially Iranian military or related forces, you're just not going to risk it. It's not worth it in terms of putting your crew at risk, in terms of putting your assets at risk. Things will not return to normal trade until we get some kind of comprehensive ceasefire peace deal that reopens the strait.
I wonder if I could just ask you about the flow of maritime trade in general, because we're seeing in certain places, Ireland and parts of the UK, there are protests over fuel shortages now. We've seen similar kinds of things play out in parts of Asia as well. Can you explain to me why it is that some places are being impacted earlier by shortages than others?
Yeah, a lot of this is down to what's normally coming out of the Middle East Gulf and where that is going. So, for example, a lot of the crude oil, a lot of the LNG, the gas coming out of there was going east towards Asia. So those markets are the ones that are sort of being impacted in terms of a physical cargo availability first. So that's why you've seen situations for example, in Bangladesh, where there's a shortage of diesel. You've seen very higher prices, particularly sort of in Australia as well. If we look at the Atlantic, there's a lot more supplies there in terms of you've got US resources, you've got sort of, from Norway as well. So in terms of physical availability, there is more, but prices are going up everywhere. And so a lot of it depends on, how much stock you've got. If you have reserves, you can then feed into the system. And for those countries that don't, or perhaps, for example, you mentioned Ireland, where agriculture, big use of diesel, where there's a lot of demand, you start to see, an impact there. So it is not equal across the market. It's differentiated depending on exposure and also availability of reserves.
I want to go back to the U.S. blockade itself. We know that Iranian-connected ships going to Iranian ports are certainly going to be in the crosshairs of the Americans in this blockade. What about ships from other countries? And I'm thinking China in particular, which relies so heavily on Iranian oil. Are they staying away?
So this is the big question. So obviously Iran, was shipping about 90% of its crude to China, and China has sort of good reserves of crude. So it doesn't desperately need the Iranian crude right now. So it can kind of supplement. But I think that is the big question. If we had a Chinese tanker loaded with Iranian crude that was going towards, the US blockade, what would be the response there? And to be honest, we don't know at this stage. Hopefully, it won't come to that. But yes, I think that is the big question the market's asking, because, if China does not take the Iranian crude anymore because of the blockade, they will have to look elsewhere. That will then be pushing up prices for everyone else.
I don't know how many years, Alexis, you've watched maritime trade, but is there a corollary? Is there anything else in your career that compares to right now?
Look, I think nothing compares to this scale. I think perhaps the one thing we could use as an example is when we had the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and we cut off the grain out of the Black Sea port. So Ukraine is a big exporter of grain. Because of the invasion, we saw no shipping moving through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus out into global markets. That is probably the best analogy, although it's on a much smaller scale compared to this. What we saw in the Black Sea was actually there was a UN-brokered sort of humanitarian corridor for shipping to leave Ukraine, go to global markets. I think in this situation we have in the Middle East Gulf at the moment, that is probably our best bet, to getting shipping restarted in the near term. But I think we're a long way off that happening at the moment.
It's all really interesting. All right, Alexis Ellender, thank you so much.